Okay. The committee will come to order. Before we begin, I'll note that minutes ago, we all had the pleasure of rededicating the Sam Johnson Room to make it compatible with Americans with disabilities and doing it in such a way that we've doubled the amount of subcommittees on the committee who can now hold hearings there. More importantly, is a tribute to our colleague, Sam Johnson, and a truly remarkable, memorable tribute to him. But it didn't happen by itself. I want to take a moment to thank Chris Stopman, who spearheaded this project for us, and Matt Weidinger. Thank you for doing a remarkable job on the Sam Johnson Room. Members, join me in thanking them for this very special room. In the past year, this committee's crafted, passed, and seen enacted into law comprehensive tax reform for the first time in a generation. Last week, over the course of 2 days, we passed a series of bills designed to improve consumer choice and reduce the prices consumers pay for important health coverage. In prior weeks, we worked together to approve important reforms designed to reduce dependence on and abuse of opioids and improve our nation's welfare system so more low-income parents can find and enter work. But not every mark we hold is about broad themes or once-in-a-generation reforms needed to strengthen our economy and hard-working families. Sometimes we will consider individual bills crafted by our members that simply merit the committee's review and support. Today's markup is an example of this with H.R. 3309, the Social Security Online Tools Innovation Act, H.R. 6377, the Save Community Newspaper Act of 2018. Social Security Online Tools Innovation Act, which is sponsored by Social Security Subcommittee Chairman Sam Johnson, will require the Social Security Administration to provide tools that disability insurance beneficiaries can use to understand how work would affect their benefits. We know that 40% of beneficiaries are interested in returning to work. Yet in a given year, less than 0.5% earn enough to stop receiving benefits. While many disability insurance beneficiaries are unable to return to work, for those who want to try, we know that the SSA's rules are just very complex. The Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015 made important changes to help disability insurance beneficiaries return to work. And this bill builds on that good work with another tool to help those who can return to work to do so. Second bill up today is the Save Community Newspapers Act of 2018, sponsored by Congressman Eric Paulson, together with Congressman Dave Reichert and Congresswoman Susan DelBene. This bill will allow local newspapers to continue to serve their communities while retooling to meet changing preferences in today's news environment by providing them with alternative funding rules with respect to their historic pension plans. Let me take a moment to note the importance of retirement and other savings. We are committed, as a committee, to finding ways to help families save both earlier and more throughout their lives. We're also committed to finding ways to encourage businesses, local businesses, small businesses, to offer retirement plans, savings plans for their workers. I know this is important. My colleague, Mr. Neal, who's worked many years in this space, look forward to working together on this shared priority. As I said, these two bills today are important bills that our members have drafted to address specific needs. I congratulate the authors, co-sponsors, and look forward to our discussion of each bill. I'll now recognize Mr. Neal for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much for holding today's markup of these two important bills that will improve our public and private retirement systems. The Social Security Online Tools Innovation Act is intended to help Social Security disability beneficiaries who are interested in trying to go back to work. The bill would direct the Social Security Administration to publish a calculator tool on its website that would help beneficiaries understand how earnings would affect their Social Security benefit amount and eligibility. The second bill, the Save Community Newspapers Act, would provide pension funding relief for a number of community newspaper plan sponsors. This bill provides these struggling employers with some wiggle room, allowing them to contribute less money to their pension plans each year. And that means maintaining jobs and strengthening their businesses while at the same time maintaining their pension plans. And on another front, I know that we're all concerned about what is happening given tariffs and newsprint costs for community newspapers across the country. and how important it is to address that issue as well. I'm pleased to support both of these bills today, and I thank the chairman for bringing them up. It's imperative that we do much more to address our current retirement crisis than simply acting on these two bills. Today, our country is in the midst of a crisis, as I've noted a moment ago, when nearly half of the American private sector employees, roughly 55 million people, work for an employer that does not offer a retirement plan. Most of these workers are employed by small businesses, the fastest growing segment of our economy. Too many workers in this nation reach retirement age without the savings they need. We have to make saving easier and do more to encourage workers to begin saving earlier. I have a number of bills that would do just that. My Automatic Retirement Plan Act would provide a savings opportunity at work for approximately 30 million American workers. I've introduced the Retirement Plan Simplification and Enhancement Act, which includes a number of common sense reforms to simplify and enhance our retirement rules. A number of other members on this committee also have retirement bills that would help to address the retirement crisis. For example, Mr. Kind and Mr. Kelly have introduced RESA bills that would encourage middle-class families to save more. This bipartisan bill enjoys the support of both industry and AARP. I'd also be remiss if I didn't highlight the multi-employer pensions, which are definitely in crisis. About 10 million Americans participate in multi-employer pension plans, and about 1.5 million of them are in plans that are quickly running out of money. These are American workers who planned for their retirement, people who year after year chose to contribute to their pensions instead of taking an increase in their hourly wage. Then, after working for 30-plus years, their planned retirement could be taken away from them, and taking it away at a time when they no longer have time to prepare for retirement because they're now in retirement. It's critical that we address this crisis and help these Americans whose retirements are at risk through no fault of their own or no fault of the employer, I must add as well. In conclusion, I'm pleased that the chairman has brought up these two bills today. I hope that there is an opportunity for us to further enhance retirement savings. We need to come together on a bipartisan basis to really address the retirement crisis, and I hope and expect that the chairman will do just that.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Our first order of business, H.R. 3309, the Social Security Online Tools Innovation Act. I recognize the bill sponsor, Mr. Johnson, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since I became chairman of the Social Security Subcommittee in 2011, we've looked at the disability program from nearly every angle, and we've heard time and time again that Social Security makes things too complicated for folks who want to return to work. My Social Security Online Tools Innovation Act is a common sense bill that will provide folks information so that it's easier to go back to work. Well, while not everyone receiving disability benefits can return to work, experts tell us more people would return to the workforce if given the chance. In fact, surveys show that 40% of beneficiaries are interested in working, but beneficiaries face complex work incentives that are hard to understand and may discourage people from returning to work. We need to make sure that if an individual wants to work, Social Security makes it as easy as possible. And we can start by making sure Social Security gives beneficiaries the information that they need. This bill is based on legislation that I first introduced way back in 2014. It requires Social Security to develop online tools to help people entitled to disability insurance benefits to better understand the potential impact of earnings on their benefits. People who use these tools would also receive explanations of Social Security's work incentives. This tool isn't meant to substitute for help from an expert. Instead, it's a complement to these conversations and for people who don't have access to a trained benefits counselor. These new tools can provide information that wouldn't otherwise be available. We also all know that Social Security sometimes makes mistakes. The chairman amendment makes clear that beneficiaries are protected from an overpayment due to any inaccuracies in information the tools may provide. This is already Social Security's policy, and it's just common sense. This bill has support from a number of groups, including AARP, the Association of Mature Americans, and the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities Social Security. The Council of State Administrators advocates vocational rehabilitation. The Employment Network Advocacy Coalition, the National Association of Disability Examiners, the National Council of Disability Determination Directors, and the National Council on Independent Living. I also want to thank my colleagues, Mr. Reed and Mr. Bishop, for their support. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll recognize the bill's original co-sponsor, ranking member, Social Security, Mr. Larson, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, if I might, as a point of personal privilege, as you acknowledged earlier, what a tribute earlier this morning to our esteemed colleague, Sam Johnson, and to the naming of the room today is, as I like to say, I'm hoping I hit the trifecta. I was there for the unveiling of the portrait here with his two daughters, and was able to be there this morning with the opening of the room and the delivery of the keys and the embedding of the POW bracelet on that podium. What a tribute to the great American. Now, if we can only get to Plano, Texas for that hearing, then we're going to be just fine. But in typical fashion, the author of this bill, and you hear him use the words common sense and straightforward. That pretty much describes the author of the bill, and as he has indicated in his opening statement, his tireless work to help simplify and make common sense out of a bureaucracy and continue to aid people. I want to especially note today at the opening of the room how grateful he was for the work of both Speaker Ryan, Leader Pelosi, and of course our Chairman Kevin Brady about making sure that that room was accessible to the disabled. As he noted in this bill, he also was tireless on making sure that in an effort to try to help and ease and get people who desire to be so to continue to work and be productive, that we also take into consideration those disabilities and make sure that if for some reason the calculator didn't work, that they would be held harmless and there would be no attribution on their part. They would be held harmless in any matter. So I commend the chairman for his lifetime of work on this committee and in his efforts to make sure that we ease and continue to streamline benefits for those who are in need of them, and his sensitivity to the disability community. I'm a proud co-sponsor of the bill, and with that, I will yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 3309. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in nature substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Amy Shewart, Staff Director for the Social Security Subcommittee, to provide the technical description of the amendment in nature substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after her presentation. Ms. Shewart, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Brady. Chairman Brady, Ranking Member Neal, members of the committee, H.R. 3309, as introduced by Representative Johnson, seeks to help individuals return to work by requiring the Social Security Administration to develop online tools to show beneficiaries how potential earnings may affect their benefits. As described on the green sheet distributed yesterday, the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute changes the short title and makes a series of technical and clarifying changes. The chairman's amendment limits the scope of the tools to individuals entitled to disability insurance benefits. It also provides the SSA additional flexibility regarding the number and the location of the tool or tools on the agency's website. In addition, the chairman's amendment includes clarifying language which ensures existing law and agency policy applies if an individual receives an overpayment due to inaccurate information provided by the tools. Chairman Brady, that concludes my walkthrough, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Stewart. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Pascrell, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I support the legislation. I believe it is a reflection of Sam Johnson and his stellar life. Sam Johnson will be truly missed. He is a patriot in every sense of the word. And he will always be a patriot. And he's always been up front. So God bless Sam Johnson. God bless this legislation, which helps us begin the move to face our responsibilities. But we have other responsibilities. There is no recess from reality. While standing next to Mr. Putin, the brutal dictator, President Trump attacked our intelligence community, our law enforcement community, and gave false moral equivalence between America and Russia. It was as if the two were reading from the same script. In response to this shameful performance, Republican members, including some on this committee, had some pretty weak comments, in my estimation. One member said, quote, "Today's press conference was an affront to American democracy and the intelligence community and a victory for Russian propaganda." Another said, quote, "Lest anyone think otherwise, however, Vladimir Putin's Russia is not a trusted friend of the United States. We must hold Russia accountable," unquote. The time for kowtowing to Mr. Trump is over. The evidence of corruption is all around us. This committee could act right now to hold this president to account. We've gone over that for the last year. We must know if Mr. Putin has compromised our commander-in-chief, Mr. Chairman. Instead of sitting quietly beside the president, I hope we could come together to defend the nation. Neither Democrats or Republicans are privy to this responsibility. We all take the oath. It is a choice to issue weak statements of opposition without action. It is a choice to turn a blind eye to corruption. It is a choice to ignore the many documented financial connections between Mr. Trump and Russia. This committee can act to get this tax returns using the 6103 form. We've done it before. We could do this right now. History will condemn our inaction. Thank you, and I yield back.
Excuse me, thank you. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Are there any? Mr. Bishop, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, I want to, if I could, share my support of the bill. I want to thank the chairman, express my strong support for 3309, Social Security Online Tools Innovation Act. This is a very confusing and intimidating process. I commend the chairman, Sam Johnson, for raising this issue and bringing forward this solution. I'm proud to co-sponsor it. It would require the Social Security Administration to create an online tool that individuals could use to learn how potential earnings may affect their Social Security disability insurance payments. In my home state of Michigan, we have a similar program known as the Disability Benefits 101 Calculator, which allows individuals who consider returning to work to get a better idea of the effect this would have on their benefits. While I recognize that many disability beneficiaries are unable to return to work, There are individuals receiving disability insurance benefits who may want to return to work, but who are unsure what the decision would mean for their benefits. Again, this is a confusing process. It's intimidating for a lot of folks who call in or have to, God forbid, visit their field office to be able to ask the right questions and understand, more importantly, the answers that they're getting from the individuals and the representatives at Social Security. A 2015 survey, in fact, showed that over 40% of disability beneficiaries are interested in returning to work, yet very few ever re-enter the workforce. And finally, this legislation would help these individuals get a clear understanding of what returning to the workforce could mean for their benefits, could mean for their families, and it would help them make an informed decision about their future and the future of their families. So again, I commend Chairman Sam Johnson for his leadership, for addressing an issue that's very important to a lot of people. Social Security benefits are extremely confusing, and the process is extremely intimidating. And I believe that putting this important bipartisan bill forward will be a great step in the right direction, helping the very people that we represent. So I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting it, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Mr. Blumenauer, you recognize.
Thank you. I would like to add my appreciation for the work that our friend and colleague, Congressman Johnson, in terms of being able to guide this legislation forward. You have people acknowledging how good it feels to actually get down to work, do something on a bipartisan basis that makes a difference for Americans, and I laud that. I must note, however, that today will mark the 400th meeting of the Ways and Means Committee since the Republicans took control, where we have not addressed one of the areas where we could have the same sort of warm glow, bipartisan progress that would make a difference for Americans, and that's meeting our responsibilities to rebuild and renew America. It's no secret that America's falling apart as we're falling behind. We, as a committee, have not met our obligations as the one committee that is tasked with how we finance this important task. There's broad support across the country, broad support on Capitol Hill, broad support in Congress. And I'm really embarrassed as a member of the committee that we've not been able to have time in the last 400 hearings except for one 5-minute witness. I hope that there's still time in this Congress that we would own up to our responsibilities, convene a broad, diverse group of spokespeople who would tell us what they would like us to do to at least give an ear, and perhaps we could have the same sort of warm, glowy feeling dealing with rebuilding and renewing America that we're celebrating today with the work of Mr. Johnson. I would like unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir, without objection.
Thank you for your courtesy. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are none, questions on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 3309 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Question is on favorably reporting the bill, H.R. 3309 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 3309 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 6377, the Save Community Newspaper Act 2018. I'll now turn to Mr. Paulson, the bill's sponsor, to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased that the committee is acting on H.R. 6377, which will provide targeted relief to community newspaper pension plans. I want to thank my colleagues, first of all, from Washington State, Congressman Reichert and Congresswoman Del Bene, for their leadership on this bipartisan solution. The bill before us takes a very narrow approach that will help community newspapers, such as the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, to fulfill its financial obligation to over 3,200 pensioners while also giving the papers the runway necessary to find their financial footing. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune, or the Strib, as it's known to many Minnesotans, has been the paper of record in Minneapolis for 151 years and has a circulation of over 500,000. The Strib, like the other newspapers impacted by this bill, have local ownership. The Strib's ownership is invested in the success of the paper, the education of its readership, and the ability to honor its financial obligations. And during a time of sweeping industry consolidation and change, where newspapers are bought by larger groups and online platforms are competing with traditional print, these organizations are committed to investing in the business and ushering the business model further into the 21st century. By changing the pension funding mechanism, these newspapers will have the certainty that they need to make payments to fund their plan. The bill does not authorize any public funds to subsidize these pensions. These pension plans are frozen, meaning that there are no new entrants into the old defined benefit plan so that the hole will not be dug deeper. So I ask my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield the remainder of my time to my colleague, Congressman Reichert.
Thank you, Mr. Paulson, for yielding. And Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to speak today also in support of the Save Community Newspaper Act. This is a bipartisan solution to a problem faced by community newspapers across the country. By providing these papers with more time to meet their long-term pension liabilities, we're giving them a chance to adjust their operations, keep their employees, and maintain a place in their communities. And I also want to thank Mr. Paulson and Ms. Delbenny for their work on this important bill. It is critical not just for our local community newspapers, but also for the communities that rely upon them and their workers that they employ. This is a bill that increases revenue by $13 million, not a lot by the measure of our federal budget, but it does. It applies to plans that are frozen, meaning no new employees will be added to these plans. It's just giving the newspapers, these family-owned small businesses, a longer runway to adjust their business and meet their longer-term pension liabilities. So, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support this important bill, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. I now recognize Ms. Delbenny, the original co-sponsor of the bill, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleagues, Representative Paulson and Representative Reichert, along with Representative Ben Ray Lujan and my Senator, Patty Murray, for supporting this effort. In my home state of Washington, we're facing the prospect of the Seattle Times, a family-owned newspaper, having to lay off workers and send its pension to the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the PBGC, which already owes around $11 billion more than it has. With pensions around the nation in crisis, that number could balloon by some estimates to $100 billion. But with this small fix, we can avoid adding yet another list of failed pensions to the PBGC's docket and smooth out payments so that papers like ours and a handful of others can make payments to retirees and keep hundreds of workers employed. This is the low-hanging fruit. It's a narrow, common-sense solution that will ultimately save taxpayers money. But we need to do so much more. The PBGC is in crisis, and so are Americans across the country who are facing the very grave prospect of retiring without the income they need to meet their most basic needs. There's no shortage of bipartisan work on policy ideas that could go a long way towards giving hardworking Americans the ability to retire with dignity. I hope we will visit those without further delay and allow this committee to work in a bipartisan, transparent manner to solve not just problems that impact hundreds or thousands, but those that impact millions of Americans that need our help. I encourage my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Delbenny. We'll now proceed to consideration of H.R. 6377 without objection. The measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time I offer an amendment in nature substitute, which is distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, Staff Director for Joint Committee on Taxation, provide the technical description of the amendment in nature substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask the members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The members of the committee have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 63 and JCX 64, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. By background, over a year ago in the Pension Protection Act, the Congress established certain minimum funding standards for pension plans, specifying interest rates that should be used to calculate pension liabilities and potential shortfalls and identify targets for making up those shortfalls. In subsequent legislation, the Congress has changed the funding requirements and the calculation of the target amounts on at least 2 occasions. The legislation that you have before you would apply to employers that maintain a community newspaper plan, a plan for which the participant benefits have been frozen. That means no increases after December 31st of last year, and would provide the employer to elect to apply an alternative funding rule. And this would mean an alternative interest rate calculation in terms of meeting the targeted amounts and therefore the minimum contribution amounts to meet that long-term target. The chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute, provides clerical changes that affect the effective date, which is applicable to plan years beginning after the date of enactment. And it also clarifies that for the purpose of defining employers and what a controlled group means, that we look to certain definitions under present law section 414. That concludes my brief description of this legislation. Be happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you, Mr. Barthold. Are any questions about the amendment in nature of substitute? Mr. Neal, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to call attention to, in my opening comments as well, as to what the tariffs are doing with Canada at the moment. I've been in touch with Ambassador Lighthouser to talk about that, but it is driving up the cost of newsprint, and I think that we all have an interest in, at some point, discussing this issue as well, perhaps at a full hearing, or have the ambassador up to talk specifically about this cost. But, Mr. Barthold, the Save Community Newspapers Act is targeted to provide pension funding relief to struggling community newspapers. However, the bill also extends its benefits to other businesses under common control. Therefore, assuming that this bill becomes law, if a small community newspaper with a frozen pension plan were to be purchased by another company with a pension plan, would that company also receive the pension funding relief even if they don't require the relief?
Mr. Neal, at the legislation does provide that, again, at the election of the employer, the employer may elect to apply the alternative funding rules specified under the legislation to the plan of the newspaper, as you described, or any other plan within the controlled group. So if I owned a community newspaper and I bought a separate, which qualified, had a frozen plan, and bought a separate business, and that business had a defined benefit plan under this legislation, yes, I could elect the alternative funding rules for that second business.
Thank you, Mr. Barthold. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to support the Save Community Newspapers Act today, and I think it's the right thing to do, and I'm certainly urging colleagues on our side to do the same. I hope we'll be able to work together to address this technical problem before the bill is taken up on the House floor.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Neal. Look forward to working with you on this. Mr. Kine, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I just quickly want to echo what Mr. Neal just said about the Canadian tariffs, the impact it's having on driving up costs for our local newspapers. I've heard from many of them back home in Wisconsin who are very concerned, and most of them, as we know, are struggling to survive and operating on a very thin margin. And this is just another instance of unilateral action being taken by the administration that could jeopardize local news print and the ability of people to get local news content. But Mr. Barthold, more specifically on this piece of legislation, the alternative funding mechanism that's contained in the bill, that's discretionary or optional? It's not mandatory for these newspapers?
It's at the election of the employer. So yes, it's discretionary.
Do you know how many newspapers total are affected by this bill?
We don't have an exact count to tell you briefly how we developed the estimate of this provision. Is we sampled a large number of plans to identify qualifying newspapers, but we did not sample all plans, so I do not necessarily have a total count of all plans, but I can tell you that our sample had at least 15 such plans.
Okay, and is it safe to assume that these plans are in 5 states, Washington, Maine, Minnesota, Georgia, Texas?
I know of 4 states. I'd have to actually ask my colleague about some of those other plans. As I said, we identified at least specifically 15 different employers, so I don't know if that's all within 5 states or not, sir.
As Mr. Paulson indicated, there's no public funds that are involved in this legislation, correct?
There's no
public funds involved.
That's correct, sir.
Right. And there's 2 major changes that are being offered here. One is extending out the amortization period from 7 to 30 years. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And the other is the interest rate calculation for funding obligation going to 8%?
You may elect as the alternative an 8% interest rate.
So that means, just to be clear, would that entail that 8% a higher contribution level then? For the
a lower contribution level.
A lower contribution.
In the short term, remember, it is a long-term plan.
Yeah, but these are frozen plans, so no new entrants will be going into them. No new pensioners.
No new entrants generally, no new benefits.
Well, no new benefits either?
The benefits under the plan could not be increased.
Okay. And do we have an actuarial analysis of how much this will extend the solvency of these plans? Will it make them completely solvent, or does this just kick the can down the road a little bit?
My colleagues did not undertake an actuarial analysis, sir.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Bartold, I didn't identify a Texas newspaper that is impacted by this. Did your survey identify that?
I would have to ask my colleague. I did not. A couple of the newspapers that were identified by the members did not include Texas. I do not have. I do not have knowledge at present that any newspaper in Texas is affected.
Thank you very much.
I can check if you would like, sir.
Sure. Mr. Reed, you're recognized to question Mr. Bartold.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Bartold, I have a question for you. But first, I do support this legislation. And I do believe it's a canary in the coal mine in regards to a bigger issue of pension funding overall in America that is bordering, if not already past, the level of a crisis type of situation we all know as members of Congress is coming down the pipeline that has to be dealt with in regards to stabilizing those funds and addressing those pension statuses as we speak. So hopefully we'll take additional action. And I know Mr. Neal on the other side shares the concern as we've worked with him on these issues, and look forward to continuing to work with my friends on the other side to stabilize all pension plans, not just these with community newspapers. But one thing caught my ear, Mr. Bartold, in your response to the question about the acquisition of these plans or potential by a future employer that acquires a business that is subject to the relief under this proposed legislation. And I just want to make sure we're clear. This has to be a business that is in the newspaper business as defined under the proposed statute, or are we opening up the door to any employer, even if it has an unrelated business that is not associated with this, that would get the benefit for this type of funding treatment in regards to their pension plans that they may not qualify under this proposal unless they acquired. If you understand what I'm asking. Yeah, I want to make it very clear that we're not opening up Pandora's box and that any unfunded pension plan can just acquire one of these community newspaper plans and then gets the relief across all of their pension liability as defined under the code. Well,
Mr. Reed, you're correct. The point that Mr. Neal raised in his question was under a controlled group. You do have to start with a newspaper business, but within the group there could be a non-newspaper business. For example, some newspaper businesses also own a radio station. They could be under the same controlled group.
So just say, like, I own a mining business, and I own a trucking business, and then all of a sudden I have a pension liability that's going off. Could I just acquire one of these community newspapers that's in bankruptcy, pull it out of bankruptcy, then own it, and then get the benefit for my previously established pension liabilities to those truckers or miners?
I'd say as a general matter, no, because there are, under the legislation, there's other requirements. And it cannot be a public company. There's supposed, that would limit the extent to the hypothetical that you were posing.
I appreciate that. I just want to make sure it's clear that we're not opening up a huge opportunity for a Pandora's box here. Thank you. That yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. Mr. Rice, you're recognized.
Mr. Barthold, I just want to straighten something out. I got a little confusion. You said you'd surveyed 15 newspapers, or you had identified 15 newspapers this would apply to?
Mr. Rice, we have we've tried to assemble data on all pension plans, and then the task is to link the plans to employers, because as the members are aware, the plans are set up with trusts, and some employers have multiple plans. So we took our sample of pension plans. We had them tied to, we had them linked to employers. We then searched that to see who would qualify as a community newspaper under the definition of the statute.
How many
we
did you
did not
identify?
sample the, we did not do that exercise for the entire universe of pension plans. We did it on a smaller sample.
How many did you identify?
And we had, within the smaller sample, 15. So there's likely more than 15, but identified.
So it's a very small group, a very specific group.
Well, the definition of community newspaper, for example, is limited, as I just noted. It can't be a publicly, it can't be a publicly traded newspaper. It has to be essentially closely held. You can only be operating, providing newspaper services within a specific geographic area.
And each of these entities have underfunded pension plans? They have liabilities that they have to?
Yes, sir.
And what we're doing is we're stretching out their obligation so they don't have to pay as much now. They pay it over time.
They have to pay more later.
And so you said it actually saves the government money. Is that right?
Well, what we report to the members to the Congress for the fiscal planning purposes is a 10-year budget period. By reducing short-term contributions to a pension plan means the newspaper business will have higher income in the budget window. Higher income, subject to tax, so relative to.
So they don't get as big a deduction for their pension contributions because they're making smaller pension contributions.
That's correct. Their pension contribution would be.
But if ultimately their pension plan is not fully funded because they didn't make the bigger contribution, then the government will have to make up that difference, correct?
If it falls to the PBGC under the legislation, there would be higher contributions due from the same owner later. So a smaller contribution years 1, 2, 3, a larger contribution years 15, 16, 17.
Which is outside the window that you looked at.
Which is outside the budget window, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Renate, you're recognized to question Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, I just want to follow up on Mr. Reed's comments because I wasn't going to ask any questions, but when I was in business, I had a controlled group, so I do understand what that means, and I had all kind of businesses. I had everything from car dealerships to nursing homes to everything else. So, and I wasn't public. So I'm going to ask the question based on my business. If I acquired a newspaper that had this situation, I wasn't a public business and I was a controlled group, could I use this benefit for all of my companies?
I believe under the legislation as drafted, the answer is yes, you could elect to apply the alternative funding for the plans of any or all of the businesses within the controlled group.
All right, thank you.
Dr. Davies, you're recognized.
I'm an ardent supporter of community newspapers. The Chicago Defender is the oldest and most respected African-American newspaper in the nation. As a community newspaper, it has informed tens of millions of people about critical social issues such as segregation and helped drive social movements such as the Great Migration. I also make great use of the Chicago Crusader, the Austin Weekly, the Austin Voice, the Citizen, the Oak Park Journal, and the North Lawndale News, as well as others. While this bill provides important pension funding relief to community newspapers, Illinois is home to tens of thousands of retirees in the Central State Pension Fund, the largest multi-employer pension plan facing insolvency. The 400,000 beneficiaries of Central States deserve help. The millions of other retirees facing insolvent plans deserve help. We should advance legislation to secure these pensions, to protect these workers who served decades with the promise of a pension. We should also work to improve retirement savings. For example, when we considered the Republican tax bill, I offered an amendment with Mr. Lewis and Mr. Thompson to improve retirement savings and lower educational debt by allowing employers to make 401k matching payments for employees making student loan payments who cannot afford to contribute to their retirement savings. Any contribution to retirement savings is particularly limited for millennials struggling with heavy student loan debt. The average student loan balance for 2016 graduates was $37,172, and only 30% of young workers use 401k programs to save for retirement. Our policy would engage young workers with student loan debt into saving for retirement earlier and enable these workers to repay educational loans faster and have a better opportunity to invest more in their retirement. For example, according to early user data from Student Loan Genius and GradFin on business-driven educational debt repayment plans, employees in such plans repaid their debt in full, on average, about 6 years faster than they would have without the employer contribution. The Republican leadership failed to consider this important retirement change, but our committee should consider it as part of pension reform. I support H.R. 6377 and urge my colleagues to embrace more comprehensive efforts to protect pensions and improve retirement savings. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any questions about the amendment, the nature of the substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Kelly, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, I was at the dedication of the Sam Johnson Room today. It's very rarely in your life you get a chance to sit or stand beside somebody who's made such a great contribution to our country. So, Chairman Johnson, it's always good to be with you, and today was especially I'm grateful for that time. Chairman Brady, I want to first let you know that I intend to vote in the affirmative for H.R. 6377, the Safe Community Newspaper Act of 2018, introduced by my colleagues. As our founding fathers well understood, access to a free press is vital to a functioning democracy. As Thomas Jefferson stated, our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost. And that starts with access to quality local community papers across the country, including those in my community, such as the Butler Eagle. To move this bill across the finish line in the Senate, however, it will most likely need to be paired with a broader bicameral, bipartisan retirement bill called RESA, the Retirement Enhancement and Savings Act, introduced by myself and Congressman Kind in the House. In the Senate, it is supported by the Republican chairman of the Senate Finance, Senator Hatch, and ranking member Wyden. RESA has been voted out of the Senate Finance unanimously and is overwhelmingly supported by the full Senate. Therefore, it's my hope that Chairman and Ranking Member Neal will continue to work with your counterparts in the Senate to marry this bill along with RESA so that more Americans have access to quality employer-provided retirement. All Americans should have a little more gold in their pockets when they enter their golden years. And this is sure a way to do it and get it done. and do it the right way. So I want to thank you for consideration, and Mr. Kind, I want to thank you. We've been together on a lot of good bills, I think, that serve the American people. This has nothing to do with Republicans or Democrats, by the way. It does have to do with what's good for the American people. So I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Larson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend Mr. Paulson, Mr. Reichert, and Ms. Delbene. I intend to support this legislation. I think community newspapers are generally family-owned, independent newspapers. They're the heart of the localities that they serve. Certainly that's the case of the East Hartford Gazette in my hometown of East Hartford. And while I will support this bill, I am disappointed that we are not addressing the larger retirement and security issues just referenced by Mr. Kelly and Mr. Kind, who have a bill, and of course Mr. Neal in his opening remarks talked about the dire state of pensions and the need for common sense, straightforward solutions. I would also note that 10,000 baby boomers a day become eligible for Social Security. We need to make sure that we address this looming issue as well. And Mr. Blumenauer pointed out that we've had 400 hearings in this committee, and we haven't talked about solving Social Security. Instead, what we've heard is the idea that it's an entitlement and that we ought to be looking to cut Social Security. What we need to do is recognize that it's not an entitlement, it's the insurance that American citizens have paid for. It's just not actuarially sound. There's no one in this room who doesn't understand that since 1983, the last time we touched the program, there has not been any premium increase in it. I dare ask, have any of your insurance policies gone up since 1983? There are common sense measures to do this and the ability to phase in and index this in a way that will assist and help and work alongside a pension proposal that is common sense as well. And the combination of the two is in the interest of the American people and not Democrat or Republican. And the more that we can put common sense issues forward of this nature, and whether it's Mr. Kelly and Mr. Kind's bill, Mr. Neal's bill, and simply even the ability to have hearings and address this straightforwardly, the vitality of ideas and the intellect that resides on this committee ought to be able to resolve those issues. And that's the point that we'd like to underscore here, and whether it's infrastructure or whether it's pensions or whether it's Social Security, this is the kind of hard work that is before us. We note that yesterday the Republican members of the committee had an opportunity to meet with the president and talk about perhaps in September more tax relief for small businesses. We'd like to focus on making sure that there's relief for people who are nearing their retirement age. 10,000 baby boomers a day become eligible, and to fix these pension programs for rank-and-file Americans who may not and who have been left out of a lot of benefits that they would otherwise receive. And with that, I will yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back, and I had to step away for a moment, Mr. Kelly, and to you, Mr. Larson. So part of that discussion yesterday with the president is because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, businesses have more money to help match and create pension plans for the workers, and families have more money to save. We think this is the perfect time to be able to make some long overdue changes to help people save more and earlier and more over their lifetime. So we look forward to working with Mr. Larson and Mr. Kelly. So Mr. Kind, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I support the underlying legislation. This seems like kind of a no-brainer attempt to try to help and support some local family-owned newspapers to meet their pension obligations. And more, Mr. Chairman, these local newspapers are becoming the guardians of our democracy, publishing news that, by and large, people trust in their local communities and that's important for our democracy today. But perhaps even more importantly, they're the guardians of the local sports scores. So we can't lose that for our constituents back home. But to a larger effect, and back referencing Mr. Neal's earlier point, we've got a multi-employer pension crisis that's just on the horizon. That'll affect over 11 million workers. 1.5 million are on the verge of losing their pensions right now. Insolvency between 10 to 20 years. But more importantly, if we don't start taking action to shore up these plans, this could be the last person out, where there'll be a rush to the doors, because no one wants to be the last one standing in this multi-employer framework and holding the rest of the obligations for everyone else. I know Mr. Neal and Mr. Brown have introduced legislation to correct this. At the very least, this committee should be holding some hearings and calling some panelists up with various proposals on how we can work together to fix this, because that is not going away. I'm supportive of the Neal bill. Many others are too. But if someone else has a better idea on how to protect the multi-employer plans, come forward and let's talk about it. But this committee has a responsibility to address it. And I've enjoyed working with Mr. Kelly, too, on our Retirement Enhancement and Savings Act. As he pointed out earlier, wide bipartisan support. We're trying to fill a black hole when it comes to retirement savings, especially affecting the small business opportunities for the employers that they have. There's been unanimous support in the Senate Finance Committee over this. As Mr. Kelly pointed out, Hatch Wyden are leading the effort on the Senate side. We've identified pay-fors, which are by and large non-controversial as well. And it also includes past legislation that I've been able to work with my good friend from Washington, Mr. Reichert, called the SAVE Act, is included in the RISA bill, and also Mr. Buchanan. The Retirement Security for American Workers Act is included in this legislation. So I'm failing to see where the roadblocks or the hurdles are in being able to move forward on this RISA bill. It seems as if the Senate's poised. There's strong bipartisan support. We've run the traps on it, and I would hope that this committee will, in the very near future, bring this up for consideration so we can break the logjam for wherever it exists and start moving this important piece of legislation that, again, puts another important piece in the overall retirement pie in place so that we're not making it more difficult for small family-owned businesses to be offering retirement savings for their workers. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kine. Just to note, I think there's a lot to agree with what you said. As you know, retirement savings and modernizing that didn't occur in the tax reform bill. The House has done a lot of good work leading into that discussion. The Senate, since we think this is a perfect time to sort of meld the best ideas of both, with the House bringing their ideas to the table as well. Mr. Reichert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to take a moment for the benefit of the members and for the record to mention some important additional facts. A company would be eligible to make the election if it meets specified criteria as of December 31st, 2017. So here are some of the points I think they're important for members to know. It publishes and distributes daily one or more community newspapers in a single state. It is not publicly traded. It is controlled either by one or more persons who are residents in each state, for at least 30 years by individuals who are members of the same family, by a trust which is created or organized in the state, and the trustee of which are all persons described above, and fourth, by a 501c3 organization organized and operated in such state with a primary purpose of benefiting local communities, or lastly, by a combination of persons described in any of the categories that I listed above. And it does not control any newspaper in any other state. For this purpose, a community newspaper is one that primarily serves an area with a population of at least 100,000 people. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to provide those facts, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Thanks, Mr. Reichert. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm encouraged to see the committee consider H.R. 6377, This signals to me that my colleagues understand the value and importance of ensuring workers receive their earned benefits after retirement. While this is helpful to a handful of community newspapers, we're still facing a major pension crisis for multi-employer plans. Currently, there are about 1,400 multi-employer plans covering almost 10 million Americans across industries such as mining, trucking, retail, construction, and entertainment. According to the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, over 100 of these plans covering over 1 million workers are in danger of becoming insolvent in the next 10 to 20 years. Central States Pension Fund, one of the largest funds in the nation, will be insolvent in just 7 years. Hardworking Americans will be forced to face retirement without real financial security, and their families that would rely on these benefits will be left with little to nothing. The crisis is coming to a head, and Congress needs to act with urgency. Workers are already experiencing the pain of underfunded, declining pensions. Just last year, 2 local Teamster unions in my district were subject to 29% benefit cut in order to save their plan. In 2017 alone, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation had to assist 72 insolvent plans to provide some sort of benefit to their participants. At this rate, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the agency that is supposed to provide a safety net, will become insolvent itself within 8 years. We cannot continue to be complacent in this space. While there are longstanding concerns with funding multi-employer pensions, where the number of contributing participants are dwarfed by retirees and the threat of employer withdrawal to the stability of the plan, we need to consider proposals that will immediately help plans in critical and declining status while preserving their benefits. This is why I support the Butch-Lewis Act. It provides low-interest rate loans to financially troubled pension plans so that the plans will have time to assist and grow their assets and pay promised benefits. Here, we are marking up a bill that is designed to shore up pension plans for community newspapers. And just yesterday, I testified before the International Trade Commission against duties that would hurt these same workers, possibly putting them into earlier retirement. We need to be looking at solutions broadly, uniformly, and strategically, and the Butch-Lewis Act is a step in the right direction. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Ms. Sewell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ensuring that Americans can retire is something that we should be spending more time on, not just for employees of newspaper companies, but also Americans that work in manufacturing and agriculture, education, food services, and every other sector. While I support this bill, my point is that we as a committee should be discussing retirement issues for all Americans. There was a time in this country when retirement, along with health care, regular pay raises, and workers' training were part of the employer-employee agreement. The workforce versus employee ratio worked in our favor, so it was easier to realize a comfortable retirement with modest personal savings. Our retirement picture looks very different today, however. Half of all workers do not have access to an employer-sponsored retirement savings plan or a pension. Too many workers are not seeing enough wage growth to save for retirement, and the strain on Social Security has never been tighter. Every day that I'm in my district, I meet at least one constituent who is working at or past an age where they hope to have been retired. Every pension plan in America, it seems, is underfunded when the markets have underperformed relative to actuaries. And multi-employer pension plans have been challenged by the disruption of whole industries, bankruptcies, and the decline of unions that pay into these funds. The hardworking constituents that I talk to are taking on part-time employment, seasonal employment, temporary employment, second jobs, even third jobs, just to make ends meet. These contingent workers and those that are part of the gig economy operate outside of the traditional employer-employee relationship. What this means is that they don't have access to conventional retirement savings vehicles. So I think that we as a committee can be focusing on talking about how we can help retirement savings for all Americans. I can tell you that many of my constituents tell me, especially those that are in the middle class, that their savings plan goes something like this. They hope that there aren't too many rainy days. They put away as much as they possibly can, and they pray that they don't live too long. Mr. Chairman, on this committee, we must do more for the American workers. We don't spend enough time talking about making retirement realistic for working families. As I yield back, I suggest to my colleagues in the majority that we should be discussing new ways to promote auto enrollment and auto escalation and new saving vehicles for low and moderate income workers to invest in. I do support today's legislation and hope that more broadly we will help all Americans for their retirement. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there any amendments to the amendment? Nature substitute? Seeing none. Questions on the adoption of the amendment, nature substitute? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion chair, the ayes have it. The amendment, nature substitute, is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 6377 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Question is on favorably reporting the bill, H.R. 6377, as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 6377, as amended, is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional dissenting, or minority views. Mr. Renacci, you seek recognition? Gentleman seeks unanimous consent to speak without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like many of my colleagues, I'm concerned about the pension crisis that faces our country. In my home state of Ohio, thousands of constituents are concerned about the fate of their retirement income as major multi-employer pension plans face insolvency in the next 7 years. It is important that Congress work together to find solutions that address the problem instead of kicking the can down the road. We have an obligation to retirees, but also the next generation of Americans to solve this pension crisis once and for all. No one is more concerned about jobs and pensions than me. Because of those reasons, I voted no on this specific legislation. But we need real solutions that do not tip the scale on behalf of one industry over another and potentially set up another loophole for controlled groups without an overall solution for all. So going forward, it's imperative that we have an honest conversation on the pension crisis our country faces and work to find real bipartisan solutions. We were elected to confront our country's biggest challenges, and there is no better time than now. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Rice, for which purpose you seek recognition?
I just want to associate myself with the comments of Mr. Renacci. I think that this bill, with a very small number of beneficiaries, such a targeted bill that relieves them from this pension liability in the face of this huge pension crisis that we have in the country, is not good policy, and I just want to associate myself with. That's why I voted no, and I will associate myself with the comments of Mr. Renacci.
Thank you. There being no further business for the committee stands adjourned.